Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time Burnside went to Northern Virginia following his successful expedition to North Carolina. In this episode, he takes command of the Army of the Potomac. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Ambrose Burnside commanded the 9th and 1st Corps of the Army of the Potomac as it marched west to combat Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia as that army invaded Maryland. During Burnside's time in North Carolina, he and his men had been met with derision as they marched through enemy country. But the march through Maryland was profoundly different. Although there were some Confederate sympathizers, Burnside and his men were greeted by townspeople as they marched along the roads and turnpikes, with citizens leaving pails of water and lemonade for the thirsty troops along the roadside. The first enemy they encountered was Confederate cavalry, which the 9th Corps pushed all the way through the town of Fredericksburg, Maryland. As the Union soldiers marched through the town, throngs of people swarmed around the general and his troops. One lady said she wished to kiss Burnside's cheek. Not to turn down the wishes of a lady, he took his foot out of one of his stirrups, and she stepped up into it and placed a kiss on his hairy cheek. Once through Frederick, Confederate soldiers were in the gaps along South Mountain, and with Burnside's troops in the lead, he was responsible for testing their strength and pushing them away if deemed possible. The 9th Corps was in the lead, and Burnside attempted to get the 1st Corps to make a rapid march to help them dislodge the rebels from Turner's Gap and Fox's Gap. However, Joseph Hooker, the commander of the 1st Corps, resented being under Burnside's command in Burnside's wing of the army, so much so that he refused to take orders from Burnside and only moved forward when the Army commander, George McClellan, sent his orders by courier. At the Battle of South Mountain, Jesse Reno led the 9th Corps into battle and was shot through the chest and died about an hour later. Reno had been with Burnside in North Carolina, and their friendship went all the way back to West Point. The death hurt Burnside greatly. Burnside communicated constantly with McClellan as the battle took place, and McClellan approved of Burnside's orders. Nevertheless, McClellan thought Burnside was elevated above his ability. McClellan wrote to his wife that, "I ought to treat Burnside very severely, and probably will, yet I hate to do it. He is very slow, is not fit to command more than a regiment. If I treat him as he deserves, he will be my mortal enemy hereafter. If I do not praise him as he thinks he deserves, and as I know he does not, he will be at least a very lukewarm friend." Because of his low opinion of Burnside's ability, McClellan unofficially took Hooker's corps away from Burnside, saying it was for logistical reasons, even though that wasn't the case. Burnside remained at headquarters with McClellan for a while, then went to Fox's Gap, where his 9th Corps were cooking a meal. He visited with them and watched as they buried their comrades. According to one story, he even refereed a confrontation between a farmer and some soldiers who were tossing bodies down his well. When the Union Army was to pursue the retreating rebels, McClellan ordered Burnside to chase after them, but the orders didn't get to Burnside until noon on September 15th. By the time he received the message, John Porter's troops were already at Fox's Gap and crowding the road, with Porter sending a message to McClellan complaining of Burnside's sluggishness. McClellan sent a message to Burnside asking what the delay was, but the message appears to not have gotten to him. When he talked with Burnside in person, he didn't bring up the lack of movement, which led one of Burnside's biographers to write, "It was as though McClellan, the master of procrastination, was deliberately fabricating a secret indictment for impunctuality against his friend." That same biographer believes that McClellan turned on Burnside when Burnside informed him that Abraham Lincoln and the Secretary of War Edwin Stanton wanted to replace McClellan with Burnside. Now McClellan knew who the President and the Secretary wanted to replace him with, and now he sought to limit Burnside's role in the upcoming battle in order to diminish Burnside's abilities in the eyes of Lincoln and his cabinet. The Army of the Potomac soon found the Army of Northern Virginia protected behind Antietam Creek. McClellan made his headquarters at the home of Samuel Pry, where the Army commander called together his subordinates. The large congregation of corps and wing commanders rode out into the pastures on the Pry farm to view the Confederate position, but McClellan thought so large a crowd would garner artillery fire, so he sent back all but one subordinate. The man who remained with McClellan wasn't the commander of the largest wing, Edwin Sumner, nor Burnside, the man Lincoln wanted to replace McClellan with, but John Porter, one of McClellan's closest confidants. A little after noon on September 16th, Burnside got word from McClellan to post his troops opposite a stone bridge and a ford across Antietam Creek. McClellan also dispatched one of his engineers to place Burnside's divisions in the correct spot. Not wanting to fool with placing them himself, the engineer had Burnside send 3 aides so that the engineer could show them the location. Then the aides could guide the divisions to the locations. By sunset, only 1 division had been placed. McClellan sent a reprimand to Burnside commenting on his slow movement and accused him of negligence and criticized him for not having his troops in place by noon. Burnside knew the reprimand wasn't warranted. He hadn't been given the orders until noon. A rain set in that night, and Burnside slept in a haystack in someone's barn as raindrops peppered the roof of the structure. The next day, September 17th, Burnside's corps under the command of Jacob D. Cox awaited orders for the day. Even the issuing of the orders came under scrutiny. McClellan reported that Burnside was late in attacking the Confederate right across Antietam Creek at the stone bridge that would soon get the name Burnside Bridge. McClellan claimed that he ordered Burnside across at 8 a.m., but he didn't write the order until 9:10 a.m. By the time Burnside got the message and handed it to Cox, it was 10 a.m. The Ninth Corps attempted to cross the bridge and the ford across the creek, where McClellan's engineer placed them, but a small Confederate force was able to use the high bluffs on the other side of the creek to halt the Union attacks. Every assault met with volleys from some Georgia troops stationed on the other side. Burnside began getting frustrated because he was following McClellan's orders and attempting to follow them exactly, especially since the commanding general was getting extremely critical of his movements. At one point, an aide from McClellan came up to Burnside, urging him to advance. Burnside snapped back, saying, "McClellan seems to think I am not trying my best to carry this bridge. You are the 3rd or 4th one who has been to me this morning with similar orders." Burnside's troops, through a dash across the bridge and the ford, gained a foothold on the opposite bank of the creek and began to push out from there. They pushed away the few enemy infantry in their front, but it seemed as though artillery pieces from all over the battlefield were trained on their position. Additionally, the large division of Confederate Major General A.P. Hill arrived on the Confederate right as Burnside's men reached the rebel side of the creek. The enemy reinforcements halted Burnside's push. By this point, Burnside himself was already across the creek, following close behind his troops who took the bridge. He and the Ninth Corps commander, Jacob Cox, worked tirelessly to form their brigades and divisions to withstand another attack. Burnside sent a note to McClellan asking for support to push Hill's men off the field. McClellan's response was, "I have no infantry," an obvious lie. He had at least the better part of 2 divisions within close support and distance of Burnside and Fitzjohn Porter's corps. The battlefield became mostly quiet, and Burnside went to McClellan's headquarters to ask again for reinforcements, but the Army commander's staff turned Burnside away, claiming McClellan was too fatigued from the day to speak with him. Early next morning, Burnside returned to headquarters and made it through the gauntlet of staffers to speak with McClellan. McClellan would send him 1 division, but Burnside wasn't to attack, he was to hold his position. Later on the 18th, McClellan ordered him to recross the creek if it could be done safely. Either because it couldn't be done safely or Burnside wasn't willing to pull his men away from the hard-won ground, the Ninth Corps did not move from their position. McClellan would accuse Burnside of being too timid during the Battle of Antietam and being too late in his attacks. The task placed before Burnside was an immense one, and he acted promptly as soon as the orders came in. Crossing the bridge and the ford was completed in a reasonable time, but historians now look at McClellan's accusations as a way to discredit Burnside. After the battle ended, Mary came to visit with her husband, traveling from Baltimore, escorted by Burnside's secretary, Daniel Larned. A few days after the battle, McClellan called some of his generals together for a party. The true intent of the party soon materialized when McClellan read Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. McClellan was furious and floated the idea of staging some kind of protest and looked to his generals for support, many of them being Democrats like Burnside. Jacob Cox, a Republican, spoke up and said that such a protest would go against civil authority and he wouldn't have as much support as he thought. Burnside also chimed in. Up until recently, Burnside was under the impression that the best way to deal with the South and slavery was to honor their slave laws, thinking this would win over the Southerners to the Union side when they realized that the Union armies meant their property and institutions no harm. However, Burnside's time in North Carolina changed his mind on the matter. There, Burnside honored the slave laws and supported returning slaves to their masters if slaves ran away. But no matter how well he followed North Carolina's laws, its citizens attacked his troops, and his kindness didn't win over any rebels. So Burnside agreed with the Emancipation Proclamation. The only way to end the rebellion was to end the institution that supported the enemy forces. By October, Burnside and his troops moved just a few miles away near Harper's Ferry and Bottler's Ford. When looking to place his headquarters, Burnside came to the home of Dr. Bottler. The doctor's 7 daughters greeted the general and his staff on the front porch, which made the staffers hope to make this property headquarters. Burnside didn't want to inconvenience the family by taking over their house, but asked to pitch tents in the orchard behind their house. Burnside shared a tent with John G. Parke as chief of staff. When Jeb Stuart took his Confederate cavalry on a raid that rode a circle around the Army of the Potomac, this humiliated McClellan. In response, the Army commander placed Burnside in charge of the 9th, 2nd, and 12th Corps and tasked them with guarding the fords and other crossings of the Potomac River from Harper's Ferry to the mouth of the Monocacy. One of Burnside's biographers claimed this was either grudging faith in Burnside's abilities or an effort to get Burnside bad press if Confederate cavalry performed such a raid again. By the end of October, the 9th Corps and Burnside were ordered south to threaten the Confederate Army in the Shenandoah Valley. The wet weather slowed down the marching columns of troops, but the general persevered. Although he hadn't been removed from command of the 2nd and 12th Corps, they were no longer within close proximity to him. Thus, he wasn't able to command them and the 9th Corps as one solid unit. Burnside and his troops bedded down near Waterloo, Virginia, on November 7, 1862. As he tried to do every night before going to bed, Burnside took some photos of Mary out of his Bible to view them and think of his love. Then, placing them back in the Bible, he laid his head down to get some sleep, but sleep wouldn't come that night. A messenger from the War Department woke up the general to hand him a message. It read General Orders 182. It removed McClellan from command of the Army of the Potomac and placed Burnside at its head. Burnside first objected, then his staffers reminded him that if he didn't accept, the position may go to Joseph Hooker. There wasn't many people Burnside hated, but Hooker was one of them. Burnside agreed to take command, then rode off with the messenger to find McClellan. They found McClellan and knocked on his tent pole. He invited the 2 men in, and after some small talk, McClellan was given the orders. He said, "Well, Burnside, I turn command over to you." He did agree to stay on for a few days to acquaint Burnside with the role, but his military career was over. McClellan briefed Burnside on his plans for an invasion of Virginia to capture Richmond. At first, using the railroads running through Virginia to Richmond to supply the Union Army seemed the most viable, but the condition of the rails and the fact that it would be difficult to guard forced Burnside to discount that idea. Allegedly, McClellan also contemplated coming back up the peninsula, but because of the disaster that resulted from his campaigning up the peninsula earlier in the year, it was unlikely to be signed off by the president. The last option would be to move along the eastern side of Virginia and use the major rivers that emptied into the Chesapeake as the locations for supply ships to dock to keep the army fed and equipped. It would be that decision that Burnside chose. Soon after taking command, Burnside was greeted at the Warrenton Hotel in Warrenton, Virginia, by General-in-Chief Henry Halleck, Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs, and Superintendent of Military Railroads, Henry Hapt. They discussed the options for launching a campaign to capture Richmond. Halleck favored using the railroads through the Piedmont region of Virginia to get to Richmond, but Burnside thought the supply line would become too susceptible to raids. The Superintendent of Military Railroads agreed with Burnside that moving the army to Fredericksburg, then south, crossing the major waterways and using them to supply his troops was best. The 3 men left Burnside's headquarters, then went to the president, who signed off on the plan. Halleck began ordering the pontoon bridges south so the army could cross the Rappahannock at Fredericksburg. Burnside, while at Warrenton, reorganized the Army of the Potomac into a McClellan-like wing system. He grouped the 1st and 6th Corps into the Left Grand Division, the 3rd and 5th Corps into the Center Grand Division, and the 2nd and 9th Corps into the Right Grand Division. The Right Grand Division, under Edwin Sumner, led the movement to Fredericksburg on November 15th. However, things were already going awry. The pontoons ordered to Washington by McClellan before he left the army were still on the upper Potomac. Henry Halleck, although he had ordered them up, didn't keep in touch with the bridge's progress and found out that because of a lack of horses and equipment to pull the pontoons, they couldn't get moving until November 18th. They would finally move by the 19th. The lead elements of the Army of the Potomac was at the Fredericksburg Crossing by November 17th, and Burnside himself arrived on the 19th. Sumner and other generals asked to cross at other fords to take the town, but Burnside waved them off because heavy rains could strand part of the army on the opposite bank and it could be annihilated. Indeed, heavy rain did set in on the 18th and would have trapped a force had it moved across the river earlier. Joseph Hooker proposed to cross at United States Ford, but he didn't wait for Burnside's response and instead wrote again, this time to the Secretary of War, in which he made the proposal and criticized his command in general. Burnside would tell Hooker not to make the move. Burnside grew worried and telegraphed Halleck about the lack of pontoons. Part of the bridging material arrived on November 24th, but there were already grumblings within the Army and outside of it. A story goes that Lincoln commented that his new general was just as slow as his old one. Nevertheless, the President met with Burnside on November 26th aboard the steamer Baltimore. There, Lincoln proposed moving additional troops to points along the Virginia coast, cutting off Lee's retreat to Richmond, and also forcing the Confederate Army to pull back from Fredericksburg. Burnside feared that delaying would put movements further into the winter months. When the President made it back to Washington, he discussed it with Halleck, and Halleck agreed with Burnside, so the plan was scrapped. Edwin Sumner, one of Burnside's Grand Division commanders, suggested crossing below the town of Fredericksburg to prevent the Confederates from sharpshooting from the buildings along the water's edge. Burnside agreed that crossing in front of the town was dangerous, so he took Sumner's plan and expanded it. He would cross both at the town and below it. Hopefully then, they could turn the Confederate Army's flank and push them away from their fortified location. Burnside called Sumner and his Grand Division commanders together at the stately Lacey Mansion, Sumner's headquarters. He outlined his plan, and the commanders listened and had no qualms. However, Burnside was feeling pressure from all around him. The stress of command and all of his responsibilities resulted in an outbreak of erysipelas, a horrible skin condition, over parts of his body. Washington wanted him to move, the Northern public wanted him to move and attack, and even the generals were eager for an offensive that might lift the spirits of the men. Burnside was also not confident in his abilities. As one of his biographers stated, he seemed to dread stepping up from command of a wing to that of the army, and his native modesty and honesty led him to confide in several officers his belief that he could not manage it. There would have been nothing wrong with that in an army made up of men like him, who stood ready to give their all to any man invested with authority, whatever he said of himself. But here in Virginia, Union generals were accustomed to looking out for themselves, covering their mistakes and carpeting their way to promotion within the shrouds of other men's reputations. Rather than endearing himself to his immediate subordinates, Sumner and a few others accepted. His admissions of doubt merely made him an easy mark for them and undermined any capacity he brought to the job. Union troops began assembling the pontoon bridges on December 11th, having to battle with Confederate sharpshooters firing across the river. After constructing the 5 pontoon bridges across the Rappahannock River, the Union Army moved across, having to fight their way across the bridges and through the town. Major General William B. Franklin's left Grand Division assembled on the Union left across from Stonewall Jackson's corps on December 12th. Burnside personally rode across the river and inspected Jackson's position for himself. After seeing the light defenses, he and Franklin decided on a battle plan. They concluded that the enemy's defenses in Franklin's sector were weaker than Sumner's to his right. Franklin recommended a fast strike against Prospect Hill the next morning, but with several caveats. The attack must begin before dawn so his men could get across the open ground without excessive casualties, and sizable reinforcements from Hooker's Center Grand Division were needed to guard the bridges. Burnside agreed and promised that orders to this effect would be forthcoming, mounted his horse, and rode back north, possibly to confer with Sumner once again. Burnside had not been sleeping well leading up to December 13th. After he left Franklin, he most likely slept a few hours before rising early on the 13th to formulate his battle plan in order to send it off to his Grand Division commanders. General Franklin, who was under the impression that the orders were to be forthcoming later in the night on the 12th, had stayed up awaiting his orders. He sent a telegram to Burnside at midnight about his instructions, but was informed that the orders would be sent when they were ready. A messenger with Franklin's orders rode out from Burnside's headquarters about 6 a.m. The roads were icy and the rider had to travel at a snail's pace. It would not reach Franklin until 7:30 a.m., way past the planned dawn attack. Franklin's mind did not ease when he got his orders. What he read did not equal what he and Burnside had discussed the evening before. It read, "Keep your whole command in position for a rapid movement down the old Richmond Road, and you will send out at once a division at least to seize if possible the height near Captain Hamilton's, taking care to keep it well supported and its line of retreat open." Franklin interpreted this as meaning he was to use one division to threaten to turn Lee's right flank and attack Prospect Hill, while the main thrust would be to his right in General Sumner's sector. Sumner also received ambiguous orders, but surmised its meaning. When the attacks got started, Burnside was under the impression that Franklin was doing as he was told and swinging around Lee's flank, but Franklin's troops had stopped short and instead just attacked Prospect Hill with one division. Information came in that there was a movement on Lee's right flank, making Burnside think that Lee was weakening his left flank to support his right. With that information, he ordered Edwin Sumner's troops to attack Marye's Heights, south of the town of Fredericksburg. Franklin eventually did put in more troops, but not a sufficient number. As the troops under Sumner collided with the Confederate defenses behind a stone wall, Burnside knew he needed to relieve the pressure in front of Sumner, so he sent word to Franklin to commit more troops. Franklin wrote back that 8 of his 9 divisions were engaged. Although technically true, only about 3 had made attacks. The others were in line and taking artillery fire, but were not making assaults against Lee's lines. Thinking he had done all he could do, Franklin stayed put the rest of the day. Burnside grew annoyed and went to see Sumner, his friend and advisor. Sumner was sitting in an ambulance at his headquarters, and a newspaper reporter overheard the conversation. Burnside allegedly said, "Everything depends on Franklin coming up on the flank." Still expecting Franklin to attack, he kept up the pressure on Marye's Heights, believing that Lee would break at some point. As one of Burnside's biographers put it, Burnside the gambler could not quit while he still had chips left. Repeated failed attacks mounted up the casualties on the Union right, and as darkness began to cover the battlefield, Burnside began formulating the next attack. It would occur the next morning, a bayonet charge, performed by his old Ninth Corps, with the commanding general himself leading the charge. 2 beliefs came about from this suggestion by Burnside. Some of his contemporaries believed he was hoping to lift the spirits of his men and instill them with the courage for another attack. The other belief, particularly from 2nd Corps Commander Darius Couch, believed it was an attempt to leave his own body on the field at Marye's Heights. The night of December 13th, Burnside came to Couch's headquarters in Fredericksburg and asked the Corps Commander to relay the events of the day, and although Burnside seemed optimistic, Couch believed the attack Burnside wanted to make in the morning was his way of ending his own life. If Burnside's morning attack succeeded, then the carnage from December 13th wouldn't be in vain, and if the attack failed, Burnside wouldn't have to suffer the pain of knowing it was all in vain. Ultimately, no one will know what Burnside's true mindset was toward the proposed bayonet charge at Fredericksburg, but Burnside was definitely shaken by the slaughter. The next morning, Burnside gathered his commanders together and outlined his plan for the charge. General Sumner spoke against such an act and said it most likely wouldn't succeed. As one of Burnside's biographers wrote, "With that reluctant admission, Sumner did the country and Burnside the greatest service of his long career. No one else could have convinced the harried commander of the need to concede defeat. From anyone else, it would have seemed to be either continued insubordination or the voice of inexperience, but Sumner was his heartiest supporter, whose judgment usually erred on the side of aggressiveness." The generals agreed with Sumner, and when the fog lifted off the battlefield and Burnside looked at the Confederate position, he canceled the orders for the attack.